Alan adjusted his tie and glanced at his watch impatiently. He was a member of the Reform Party, a passionate advocate for change, fairness, and progress. To him, every system needed constant improvement, and he was determined to be the one to lead the way. Today, he was on his way to a remote mountain town for a public debate. It was part of a national event aimed at sparking discussion on the country's future. But there was one problem. He wasn't going alone. As he reached the sleek black car waiting by the curb, he noticed a familiar figure standing beside it. A woman with a neatly pinned hairdo and a calm, reserved demeanor, tapping her foot slightly as if in sync with his own irritation. Mary. She was the spokesperson for the Conservative Party and his political rival. Mary believed that stability was key, that change should come only when absolutely necessary, and that tradition was the bedrock of any functioning society. Alan often thought of her as stuck in the past, and she thought of him as a reckless idealist. "Oh, great," Alan muttered, rolling his eyes. "They've paired me with you." Mary shot him a cool look. "Believe me, Alan, I'm not thrilled either. But we have a schedule, so let's get going, shall we?" Alan sighed and climbed into the car, sliding over as Mary joined him, carefully arranging her briefcase between them as if to create a literal barrier. The car started moving and silence settled awkwardly between them. Alan stared out the window, trying to ignore Mary's presence. She, in turn, adjusted her jacket, opening her notebook and pretending he wasn't there. But after a few miles, the silence became too thick to bear. "Are you going to spend the whole trip writing notes on why progress is such a terrible idea?" Alan asked, unable to resist. Mary didn't even look up. "If by progress you mean reckless policies that throw everything off balance, then yes, that's exactly what I'm doing." Alan rolled his eyes. "You're impossible, you know that? Not every change is a disaster waiting to happen." Mary closed her notebook and finally looked at him, eyebrows raised. "Not every change is an improvement either, Alan. Some of us actually care about maintaining a stable society." "A stable society?" he scoffed. "You mean one that stays exactly the same forever? Progress is how we move forward, and caution is how we avoid falling apart," she replied, crossing her arms. They spent the next several miles in an intense back and forth, each trying to outwit the other. Alan pointed out how policies had to evolve with the times, while Mary countered that change without thought could dismantle important foundations. Their voices rose and fell, the driver glancing at them occasionally in the rearview mirror, clearly amused by the impromptu debate taking place in his back seat. Eventually, they reached a winding road leading up to the mountains. The scenery changed as the city gave way to sprawling forests and the air became cooler and crisper. Alan leaned back, taking in the view outside, his irritation momentarily forgotten. "It's pretty out here," he admitted. Mary glanced out the window, nodding slightly. "Yes, it is. Reminds me of when I was a kid. My family used to come up to the mountains during summer." Alan looked over, surprised. "You? Camping?" She smirked. "Not exactly. My parents were not exactly the outdoorsy type, but they did like the idea of family retreats." He chuckled. "Well, I didn't take you for someone who'd enjoy a mountain view." She rolled her eyes. "Just because I believe in tradition doesn't mean I'm blind to nature's beauty, Alan." Their conversation paused, shifting into an unexpected calm. For a brief moment, they weren't rivals from different parties, but just two people admiring the same landscape. However, the truce was short-lived. As the road turned sharply, Alan's frustration resurfaced. "You know, Mary, sometimes I think you just oppose me for the sake of it," he said, half-jokingly. Mary scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself. I oppose you because I disagree with most of what you stand for." Alan shook his head, a grin sneaking onto his face. "Well, I guess that's why this debate should be interesting." Mary sighed. "Interesting, yes. Productive? That's another question." And just like that, the bickering resumed, filling the car with energetic arguments and quick retorts. Despite themselves, neither of them could resist the chance to make a point or poke fun at the other. For Alan and Mary, it seemed, rivalry was second nature. But little did they know this would be the least of their concerns as their journey continued. The car wound through narrow mountain roads, surrounded by towering pines and cliffs that dropped steeply on one side. Alan was starting to relax, watching the scenery fly by. Even Mary seemed to be loosening up, her shoulders no longer quite so rigid. She was flipping through some notes on her tablet, seemingly absorbed. But suddenly, the driver's calm voice cut through the quiet. Sir, ma'am, I think we have a problem." Alan looked up, confused. "What's going on?" The driver gestured to the rearview mirror. "There's a black SUV that's been following us for the last few miles. It's been keeping its distance, but now it's speeding up." Mary's head snapped up, her face tense. "Are you sure? It could just be another car on the road." The driver shook his head. "Not on this route. We haven't passed another vehicle for nearly an hour." Alan turned in his seat to look back. Sure enough, a dark SUV was rapidly closing the distance. Something about it felt ominous. The windows were tinted and it didn't look like it was just trying to overtake them. It was coming right for them. "What do we do?" Alan asked, a flicker of alarm in his voice. Mary didn't hesitate. "Step on it," she said to the driver. "Let's see if we can lose them." The driver nodded, his hands tightening on the wheel as he sped up. The car surged forward, but so did the SUV, sticking close behind them. The road twisted and turned, and Alan's grip on the seat tightened as they took each curve at breakneck speed. Trees blurred past, and the mountains loomed on either side, making it feel like they were racing through a tunnel. But the SUV wasn't giving up. In fact, it was gaining on them. Alan and Mary exchanged a look, both realizing that this wasn't just an accident. Whoever was in that SUV had every intention of catching them. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the air, and the car jolted. "They're shooting at us!" the driver shouted, ducking instinctively. Alan's heart raced. "Shooting? Why would they?" But then it clicked. "Mary," he whispered, his voice tense. "Do you think—" Mary nodded grimly. "It must be that extremist group. I've heard they're planning to make a statement, to shake up the political system. And what better way than to kidnap two political figures?" The SUV was now dangerously close, and Alan could see a figure leaning out the passenger window, holding what looked like a rifle. The driver swerved to avoid another shot, the car skidding as they rounded a sharp corner. "We can't outrun them on this road," Mary said, her voice laced with fear. "We need to get off this path, find somewhere to hide." "Agreed," Alan replied. He turned to the driver. "Is there a way to get off this main road? Some kind of side trail?" The driver nodded, pointing up ahead. "There's a small turnoff, but it's rough terrain. Are you sure?" "Just do it," Mary urged. As they approached the turnoff, the driver yanked the wheel hard to the right, taking them off the main road and onto a rocky dirt path. The car bounced and jolted as they sped down the narrow trail, branches scratching against the windows. The SUV hesitated for a moment before following, clearly determined not to lose them. Alan glanced at Mary, his heart pounding. "We're going to have to work together if we're getting out of this." She nodded, the seriousness in her eyes mirroring his. No more debates. Survival first. They tore through the forest, the SUV still hot on their trail. The rough path was taking its toll on both vehicles, but their car managed to stay just far enough ahead. Suddenly, a narrow creek appeared up ahead, its waters glinting in the late afternoon light. The driver braked hard. "This is as far as I can take you. If we go further, the car will get stuck." Alan and Mary looked at each other, both understanding that they'd have to continue on foot. "Let's go," Alan urged. They scrambled out of the car and ran toward the creek, their footsteps pounding against the forest floor. The sound of the SUV braking behind them only made them move faster. The trees thickened as they ran deeper into the woods. Mary's sharp breaths matched Alan's, but they kept pushing forward, ducking under branches and leaping over rocks. Behind them, they heard the voices of their pursuers, shouting and cursing as they tried to navigate through the forest. They stumbled upon a small clearing and paused, catching their breath. Alan looked around, scanning for any signs of movement. "What now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Mary glanced around, her mind working quickly. We need to throw them off. If they find us, it's over. But if we split up, we might have a better chance. Alan hesitated. Are you sure? She nodded, her eyes steely. You take the left path, I'll go right. If we're lucky, one of us can find help. They exchanged a look, one of mutual respect and understanding, before each took off in opposite directions, disappearing into the dense forest. As Alan ran, he couldn't help but think how strange it was. Here he was, racing for his life beside someone he'd seen as his rival just hours ago. And now, all he could think about was making sure they both got out of this alive. Alan and Mary stumbled through the dense underbrush, breaths heavy and uneven. They had abandoned the car miles back, their driver helping them slip away unnoticed as the black SUV roared past, the attackers oblivious to their escape into the forest. Now, they moved carefully, their footsteps muffled by thick pine needles. The silence between them was tense, though not in the way it had been at the beginning of their journey. It wasn't driven by disdain, but by the weight of what they had just been through. They were both exhausted and shaken, but there was no time for rest. They had to keep moving. After what felt like hours of trudging through the forest, they reached a small clearing. Alan sank onto a fallen log, breathing heavily. Mary sat a few feet away, rubbing her sore feet. This isn't exactly what I signed up for, Alan muttered, half smiling, though he still looked nervous. Mary let out a short laugh, surprising him. Trust me, I'm just as surprised as you are. I never thought I'd be, well, running for my life with you. They sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath. Finally, Alan broke the silence. You know, Mary, he began, looking up at the canopy of trees. You and I may not agree on pretty much anything, but I never realized until now how much we both care about this country. I always thought you were just holding us back. Mary raised an eyebrow. Holding you back? She let out a small, tired laugh. Alan, my concern has always been making sure we don't lose the things that make this country strong. Change is important, sure, but stability matters too. You can't build anything lasting if the ground is always shifting beneath your feet. Alan thought about this, nodding slowly. That's true, but if we never change, then how do we move forward? Our world keeps evolving. We need to adapt. I just don't want us to be left behind. Mary looked at him thoughtfully. So you're saying you want progress, but not at the cost of everything we've built? Alan nodded. Exactly, and I think you want stability. But maybe without ignoring the issues that need fixing. For a moment their eyes met, and something shifted. The animosity that had once been there now seemed smaller, like a distant echo. They both realized that despite their differences, they wanted the same thing, a country that was strong, fair, and prosperous. Mary broke the silence first. I guess we both have good reasons for what we believe in, she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Maybe we've been too focused on the fight and not enough on the bigger picture. Alan smiled, his shoulders relaxing. Exactly. Maybe if we spent less time arguing and more time listening, we'd actually make progress. Mary gave him a small, wry smile. Look at us, agreeing on something. Who would have thought? Alan chuckled. Miracles happen, I guess. They sat quietly for a moment, each lost in thought. It was as if, through this shared ordeal, they'd come to understand that their political battles were more than just rivalries. They were rooted in a shared commitment to the country's well-being, even if they approached it from opposite sides. Well, Mary said finally, standing up and dusting off her clothes. We should probably keep moving. They might realize we're missing soon. Alan nodded, rising to his feet. Right. And hey, Mary? Yeah? Thanks for, not leaving me behind. She gave him a genuine smile. Same to you, Alan. As they continued on their way, their steps a little lighter than before, a quiet understanding settled between them. It wasn't just survival that had united them. It was a newfound respect. And in that moment, They were no longer just political opponents on a campaign trail. They were allies bound by a shared journey and a greater purpose. Alan and Mary finally made it to a tiny mountain town, nestled between towering pines and mist-covered hills. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, with old stone buildings and narrow cobblestone streets. The townspeople welcomed them with a mix of curiosity and warmth, offering them shelter in a modest inn at the edge of town. Grateful for the respite, they settled into a small, rustic room with creaky floors and a cozy fireplace. As they sat by the fire, the soft orange glow casting long shadows, the tension between them had all but vanished. Now there was only the shared exhaustion and a sense of quiet understanding. After a while, Alan broke the silence. "You know, Mary, I never thought I'd say this, but this whole experience has made me question a few things. All the yelling, the campaigns, the endless arguments. It's like we're constantly at war, even with those who are supposed to be on our side." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Sometimes I wonder if any of it really changes anything." Mary looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "It's exhausting, isn't it?" she said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like we're just going in circles. And it's not that I don't believe in what we're fighting for, but I worry. Change is important, yes, but too much too quickly? It can destabilize things in ways that are hard to recover from. I think that's why I've held on so tightly to stability, to tradition." Alan nodded slowly, realizing for the first time that her caution wasn't rooted in stubbornness or fear. It was out of a genuine concern for the people and the country's foundation. "I can understand that," he said. "I guess I just wish there was a way to, I don't know, strike a balance, bring people together instead of driving them apart." Mary looked at him with a small smile. "Funny. I always thought you were too impulsive, but maybe there's more wisdom in what you're saying than I gave you credit for." They sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the crackling fire, each lost in thought. It was as though the walls they had built between themselves were slowly crumbling, revealing a surprising common ground. Finally, Mary spoke up. "Alan, tomorrow's debate. I don't know if we should go into it the way we originally planned." Alan raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "What are you suggesting?" She took a deep breath. "What if, instead of arguing from opposite sides, we spoke together? I mean, we both want what's best for our country, right? Maybe it's time we showed people that we don't have to be enemies just because we're from different parties. We could show them what it means to have unity, to work together." Alan's face softened. "Mary, I think that's the best idea I've heard in a long time. Imagine what that could do, seeing two people from opposing sides standing together for something bigger than their parties." They spent the rest of the evening discussing what they would say, their ideas blending in a way that felt surprisingly easy, even natural. For the first time, they saw each other not as rivals, but as partners in a common cause. In that quiet room in the small mountain town, they realized that they were no longer just debating for their parties. They were advocating for something deeper, a country built on peace, understanding, and unity. As the fire burned low, they looked at each other with a newfound respect, a silent promise passing between them. Tomorrow, they would take the stage not as enemies, but as allies, standing together for a vision of peace that went beyond party lines. The debate hall buzzed with anticipation. Politicians, journalists, and townspeople from across the country had gathered, eager to witness the clash between two of the most prominent political figures in the nation. Alan and Mary had a reputation for their intense debates, and everyone was expecting yet another heated confrontation. But as Alan and Mary stepped up to the podium, something was different. They exchanged a brief glance, a look filled with shared understanding, and nodded to each other. In that silent moment, they agreed to abandon their old arguments and speak from the heart. Alan cleared his throat and looked out at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know you came here today expecting to see us debate our usual positions, but something happened on the way here that has changed how I see things." Mary stepped forward, adding, "Yes, This trip opened our eyes to something more important than our political divisions. In the past few days, Alan and I learned what it truly means to rely on each other. We faced dangers together and, for the first time, took the time to really understand why each of us believes what we do. Alan continued, his voice steady but filled with passion. We have our differences in vision, in approach, and even in values. But at the heart of it, we both love this country, and we both want what's best for its people. For too long, our political debates have been about tearing each other down, but maybe it's time to focus on building something up, together. Mary looked out into the audience, her voice softening. We stand here today not as representatives of opposing parties, but as people who care deeply about peace, democracy, and inclusion. We believe that it's possible to have respectful conversations, to make compromises, and to find common ground for the good of all. A hush fell over the audience as people leaned forward, captivated. This was something they hadn't expected. Two rivals standing side by side, united in their message. The speech moved from the usual talking points into something deeper, a shared vision for a new political climate based on respect and unity rather than division and animosity. We're asking everyone, citizens, leaders, and our colleagues in this room, to join us, Alan said, his eyes scanning the faces in the audience. Let's begin by listening to each other, by choosing respect over judgment, and by working together instead of against one another. Mary concluded with a voice that rang with conviction. We don't have to agree on everything to build a strong and compassionate society. All we need is a willingness to listen and the courage to bridge our divides. That's how we create a lasting peace, a democracy that includes everyone, and a future our children can be proud of. The crowd erupted into applause, some even standing as cheers filled the hall. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of hope, surprise, and inspiration. For once it felt as though they were all on the same side, united in a shared purpose. Even as the applause continued, Alan and Mary felt an enormous weight lift from their shoulders. They had stepped away from the rigid confines of their parties, opening up a new path, not only for themselves, but for their entire country. And as they looked out at the crowd, they knew this wasn't the end of their journey. This was just the beginning.